But I just want to go through a couple of things, and I want to run through some numbers before I hand out the numbers to the three of you at least, because I don't want you to focus on what I'm going to hand you. I just want you to sort of listen to what this conversation is about. And so just a real quick piece of background. Pattern for Progress is a not-for-profit policy and planning agency. We work in 9 counties throughout the Hudson Valley, Westchester, Rockland, all the way up to Columbia and Greene, out to Sullivan, and everything in between. So that's how we define the Hudson Valley, although some people define the Hudson Valley a little bit differently. Pattern has been around for 54 years now. I've been around for 53 years, and I've been working in this industry for almost 30. Fresh out of school, out of college, I started in community development, and so I've got a lot of years, almost 3 decades worth of experience in working in housing, community development, economic development, urban revitalization, neighborhood planning, so on and so forth. And throughout a lot of the conversations that I've had, a lot of people get very confused and they get a lot of facts mixed up with just simple definitions. And so I just wanted to start off with explaining the definition of affordable housing. It's a very, it's a definition that can be skewed one way or the other. And in very simple terms, housing is affordable when you pay no more than 30% of your gross income towards rent or home ownership. That's it. That's all it means. It's not a term that means these people, those people, that person. It's just a very simple term about what you can afford to pay and what the government has said for many years, what you should pay for housing. If you pay more than 30% of your income, you're in a situation that's called cost burden. And Justin mentioned the term ability to pay, and that's what he was referring to, being cost burdened. And I wanted to jump a little bit deeper into some of those numbers. But before I do that, I also wanted to commend the city of Kingston for doing this process, going through this process. This is the 6th meeting, I think, in a series of 6? 7th, okay. And so throughout this process, or let me back up. Understanding what this process was, I think was initiated in January or February, which was the same time, God bless you, which was the same time that we started as an agency. We started a housing assessment, a housing needs assessment for Westchester County, a little bit bigger than Kingston. The end result was a 642-page document with lots of numbers and an analysis for every single municipality, which Westchester County has 47 of them. So it's a little complicated. In addition to the analysis of numbers and all this kind of data and stories and things, at the end of the core document came a series of 20 recommendations. One of the recommendations to Westchester County was to do this very process in each municipality, because I think the information that you're finding and the feedback that you're getting is very, very important, especially to policymakers, and that's what this group is, policymakers. So let me get into a little bit of the numbers. And in analyzing a housing cost burden, you're considered cost burden when you pay more than 30% of your income, and remember that's gross income. When you pay more than 50% of your income towards rent or home ownership, you're severely cost burdened, which is not a good situation to be in. That means more than half of your paycheck, because again it's gross, more than half of your paycheck goes to just keeping a roof over your head. Doing the calculus on that very quickly, then you have to pay all of the other living expenses. Little things like food, like getting to work, transportation, clothes, things like that. Things your kids may need for school, medication, other health care issues that you may have. It all comes out of that pot of money that is oftentimes fixed, especially when we're talking about low and very low income families. These calculations are always based in the federal language on something called the AMI, which is the Area Median Income. And those numbers just came out for 2019, and those numbers are always distributed or drafted as a county figure. So Ulster County, for a family of 4, 2019, the AMI is $83,300. I just want to give that to you as a point of reference. 83,300. And I just want to give that to you as a point of reference. 2019. Yeah. So if we were to look at these cost burden analyses, and I've got copies of this for you, just in the city of Kingston, at all income levels, so regardless of how much you make, there are 1,690 households, renter households, that are severely cost burdened, all income levels, which means that almost a third, just about a third of the renters pay more than 50% of their income towards rent. On the homeownership side, it's 680 households, which is about 16% of the owners that pay more than 50% toward housing. So clearly, when you look at the numbers and the way that the formulas work, as your income declines, your cost burden will go up. So I want to take that income level down one notch to 80% of AMI. And at 80% of AMI, 41.5% of the renters and 45.2% of the owners are severely cost burdened. If you add them together in the whole universe of renters and owners, over 71% are severely cost burdened and cost burdened. So there's over 71% of renters and owners pay more than 30% of their income towards debt. Now, when you jump down to the 50% level, 54.4% of the renters are severely cost burdened, and almost 60% of the owners are severely cost burdened. This data is, HUD lags behind about a year and a half on this data because it's very detailed, and they put this data out for every single municipality throughout the country. So the new data will be out at the end of the summer this year. So this is last year's data, so just keep that in mind. But also keep in mind that these numbers don't shift that much, as people's income in the aggregate doesn't shift that much. So I wanted to give you some numbers just to put cost into perspective for renters and for owners at different income levels. And that's really the point of what I wanted to bring to tonight's conversation. And at this point, I do want to hand you the analysis itself, which you can pass that down if you don't mind. You guys can have some too. And I also wanted to give you copies of a housing profile which our organization had done. We released it in September of last year. And this does a deep dive specifically in the city of Kingston on all sorts of housing data. And you're welcome to have those copies, take a look at them, and if you have any questions. There's a lot of data in there. There's a lot of numbers. And that's why I wanted to very, very slowly and hopefully methodically go through exactly what these numbers mean. Because an understanding of the numbers is again, it's very critical for a group who are in the policy-making positions. One more. They're available on our website as well. So that's really the gist of what I wanted to talk about tonight. And I wanted to thank you for having me here and having this platform to have the discussion. But if you have any questions, shoot.
When you're talking about, especially for homeowners, when you're talking about cost burden, does that include every cost associated with homeowning, or is it just the mortgage? Is it the mortgage and the taxes? What?
So as a homeowner, you have to look at there's four critical things as a homeowner. You're making a payment for a principal, for interest. Typically, you'll pay taxes and insurance all in one. It's called PITI, your pity payment. That does not include utilities. These analyses look at what the cost is for homeownership outside of things like maintenance, outside of things, fixing your roof, taking care of your furnace, all of those sorts of things. It's a lot of numbers to sort of absorb.
So how did you derive these numbers? Was this like door-to-door questioning? Is it some metadata? What's the source?
So every year, the HUD, U.S. Department of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, take the most current ACS data that they have, and in this case, it's 2015 ACS, and ACS stands for American Community Survey. American Community Survey is a function of the Census Bureau for collecting data in between the decennial census. So you've got going all the way back to 1880, I think it started. But in '08, I believe it was, the American Community Survey initiated itself and started with a 1-year data set, a 3-year data set, and a 5-year data set. So every year since then, they've put out these 5-year data sets, the 3-year and the 1-year. The 5-year data sets are the most comprehensive and have the least margin of error next to, of course, the decennial. So in between decennial census, this is the data that a lot of agencies, organizations, this is what we have to rely on. The next step down would, of course, be doing local surveys and collecting court data and information like that. So it's called the CHAS data, which is Comprehensive Housing Assessment Affordability Strategy data. That's published by HUD. The income information for cost burden analysis is only one component of lots of different data that is put out by CHAS. And again, it's put out at every municipal level. And it's actually even put out for something called a consolidated designated place, which is a CDP. It's like a hamlet. It's an unincorporated area.
So is this done by sampling?
Yes.
So it's not literal, like the census is door to door almost. So this is done by sampling. Okay.
And it's the most, and anecdotally, I can say that it's pretty accurate. It's a very good snapshot of what's going on in the community.
How does this compare? Do you have a sense of how Kingston compares to other Hudson River Valley towns or other significant points of comparison if they're outside the Hudson River?
Right. So off the top of my head, I don't have that, but I can very easily run those numbers for you. Okay. I mean, I can tell you that there's more cost burden in the city of Newburgh, and I believe there's more in the city of Poughkeepsie as compared to Kingston. But they're very different cities too. So,
well, this is always one of the problems, coming up with solutions, right? Well, first, do you have any questions?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, Joe, I apologize for not knowing more about Pattern for Progress, but can you just explain more, like what you do as far as how you go about helping with the problem, like as far as what
Sure. Sure. So we have where to start. So a couple of years ago, we initiated this thing called the Urban Action Agenda, and we identified 25 urban centers throughout the Hudson Valley, and it ranges from our biggest city, Yonkers, 200,000, down to our smallest little village of Brewster, which is about 2,000 people. We picked 25. We picked 25 because there's urban problems in a community of 2,000, similar to that of 200,000. We picked these 25 and based on really distress, poverty, municipal issues, and we wanted to study them deeper. So we created this urban action agenda. Our first round, we put out the publication that you saw come around that says, it says housing profile. Our first round, we put out community profiles for these 25. That was in 2015, and it was done in coordination with RPA and the Ford Foundation. Those reports, they were good, there were only 8 pages. 3 years later, so just last year, we redid the 25 community profiles for all of these communities, and we added these housing profiles. Along the way of doing these data profiles, we determined through conversation with not-for-profits, through conversation with municipal leaders, economic development officials and such, that essentially because of what occurred in Albany with the tax cap, there was less money available at a municipal level to do a lot of this kind of core work. So we started to do essentially a fee-for-service and contract-based work for municipalities, for not-for-profits, in analyzing data and coming up with solutions to some of these issues that many municipalities are facing. And a lot of these issues are shared issues. Problems here in Kingston are not that dissimilar to what's going on in Poughkeepsie, in Peekskill, in Newburgh, in Hudson, other communities. So we share that information. A lot of it you'll see on our website. And then there's other information there's other studies that we do for clients that is not shareable because it's paid for by the client and it's their data, it's their information. Overall, though, our mission is very simple: improve the quality of life of the Hudson Valley. We have a board of directors of 42. We meet every month as an executive committee. We meet quarterly as a board. We do a 3-year strategic plan. Housing, community development, economic development, workforce development has always been on the front burner. Right now we're looking at a regional study as an organization to further the Hudson Valley as far as policy is concerned, dealing with one of our largest issues, demographic decline. We're losing population. We have no disrespect, we have a silver tsunami, right? We've got aging population. What does that mean? What does it mean when the millennials don't necessarily want to live and stay in the Hudson Valley? What can we do to reverse that? We have school enrollment that's declining, drastically declining. Some districts have lost in upwards of 800 students over the last 10 years. And their projections out for the next 10 or 12 years, it's not getting any better. So how do we do, what can we do as a region to help mitigate some of these issues? That's what Pattern's about. It's hard to describe because it's a little out there.
A lot of it's on it's on your site, on your website. I can probably get a lot more detail of it.
You can.
Interesting, thank you. Thanks for doing that as well.
Sure. You're very welcome. I'll hang out a little bit.
Well, good evening. My name is Guy Kemp. I'm Vice President of Community Development at RUPCO. RUPCO is a 38-year-old not-for-profit affordable housing and neighborhood reinvestment agency headquartered here in Kingston. We're also an RPC, a rural preservation company, part of the neighborhood and rural preservation companies funded in part by New York State Homes and Community Renewal. I'd like to tell you that that's a lot of resources that come into the Hudson Valley, and for sure we work really hard to make sure that state programs and state resources come to Kingston and come to the Hudson Valley rather than going to far off distant places like Buffalo or Utica. And so we're really proud of that. Our mission is to create homes, support people, and improve communities. And at this particular moment in time, we have well over $100 million in real estate development projects occurring in 3 counties in the Hudson Valley, Greene County, Ulster County, which is our home, as well as Orange County. Proud of how dynamic that is, but I got to tell you, it's a lot of work and it's hard work, and we really do care about it. And it is inadequate to meet the housing need that we know exists throughout the Hudson Valley. It is inadequate to meet the housing needs in the city of Kingston. It's inadequate to meet them on the county basis. It doesn't serve everyone, and every unit of housing we create, there's someone who doesn't earn quite enough to qualify for that housing because they can't afford to pay the rent, even though it's subsidized. And there are people who earn just over the income limit and are ineligible for the housing because they earn too much. In years past, we relied on, in the rental housing arena, we relied on private multifamily rental opportunities to do what it did pretty well, which is meet the needs of renters at about 65% of area median income and above. And we now see that because of the rents have risen, because properties have changed hands, that the market doesn't really meet the needs of renters until they're about 85% of area median income. So that means that there's a bigger gap, and as a consequence, there are more and more folks and families who are cost burdened in our communities. It's a real problem. It's a tangible and palpable problem. Folks are making choices every day about whether they're going to pay for their heat or pay for their medicine. They're making choices about whether they can afford a new pair of jeans to send their kids to the first day of school or not. Being cost burdens has real impacts on real families and members of your community. And it's not academic and it's not abstract. With those things said, RUPCO, in partnership with the City of Kingston and the SUNY New Paltz program for internships, we decided we really needed to take a little deeper dive to understand what was causing in the escalation of rents, but also in the escalation of housing values and costs in the City of Kingston. And we looked at data sets to do that. We also worked with the mayor's office, and he identified data sets that had never really been looked at and interpreted before in terms of the opportunities for new housing development in the community. Vacant lots, properties that are unserved by water and sewer, and therefore we know they're not habitable. We started looking at different ways of addressing the issues of housing and creating housing here in Kingston. So I'm joined this evening by Shane DeVita. He's a former intern and a recent proud graduate of SUNY New Paltz. And he's going to show you some of the mapping that we've done, which I hope will be a valuable tool going forward. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk for a moment about gentrification and what I understand that to be, thinking that it would be a helpful thing for us to all be on the same page about what gentrification is and why we ought to care about it. Gentrification, simply stated, is the displacement or actions by the market to displace folks who are typically low and moderate income residents. They are usually displaced by more affluent residents who arrive here, often from elsewhere, with more education and higher paying jobs. They are typically whiter and better educated and more affluent residents who come, and the landlords have raised the rent and make the properties more attractive to them, and they can afford the properties, they can afford the rents. And what that means is that a segment of your community, those folks at 85% of area median income and below, are displaced. They cannot afford to stay in your community. That is a significant consequence. And I described the story of there are folks in lots of communities who maybe they rent a storefront on Broadway. Maybe it's a bodega or a convenience store or some other small entrepreneurial business here. And they also rent an apartment here. And the truth is, if the equation changes on either side, the building that they rent their commercial storefront in is acquired by somebody else, and that rent is jacked, or the apartment that they live in is acquired by someone else, and the rent on their residence is increased. They're out of business. They can't afford to stay here. And so it has real cultural implications for communities, typically communities of color, often folks who are really working hard and trying to keep their families here and are displaced out of your community. And I like to compare it to urban renewal. Urban renewal is a similar kind of process, and I don't need to describe in a Kingston meeting what the consequences of urban renewal are, but I want to describe to you how it's different than gentrification. It's different than gentrification because it's government-sponsored. It is government-sponsored demolition of parts of a community, resulting in exactly the same displacement we're talking about. Now, government takes responsibility for that gentrification that occurs through urban renewal, but doesn't always know or have the tools to figure out how to harness the market forces that are displacing their community and making it unaffordable for them. And so we've had a lot of conversation over the last several years trying to interpret that and understand that. So I hope that's helpful to understand the situation that you're facing, because the displacement is just as real in both of those scenarios that I've described to you. And with that said, I'm going to invite Shane to show us some of the mapping that he worked on, explain why it's important, and how this will create, I think, a beneficial tool for the city to evaluate what's happening to the cost of both home ownership and rental units in the city, and think about what maybe can be done to address it. And so I hope this is going to be a tool that can be updated periodically to guide you in policy decision making as you go forward. Shane?
Okay, so my name's Shane DeVita. Apologies, I'm getting over a cough. I'm a recent graduate of SUNY New Paltz, graduated with a bachelor's degree in geography, and within my experience there I took a lot of courses based around urban planning, and I'd have to say that they definitely helped me in this type of scenario. So the project that I'm going to be showing you guys today is something I've been working with RUPCO and also the City of Kingston on for a few months now. And we believe it will provide a great tool for people to understand what's going on spatially within the different parts of Kingston. So we created multiple projections for each of the wards throughout Kingston, all nine wards, and altogether we created 18 figures, 9 based on each ward for single-family housing sales from January of 2018 to February of 2019, and then 9 for 2 to 3 family units that were sold between January 2018 and February 2019. Just to give you guys a little ease of access, I know it's hard to read some of the numbers here. Anything blue on the map is going to be very low cost for that ward in specific, and anything red is going to be very high cost for that area in specific. And the 2 wards that I decided to display today are both located within Midtown Kingston, wards 4 and 5. And the reason I believe that these 2 wards may be some of the most important to take a look at is not only because they are a target of a lot of our urban revitalization plans, but they are showing the consequences of these plans towards people with lower incomes. If you guys would take a look at this figure here on the bottom of the chart, this shows housing sale prices over the time period of January 2018 through February 2019. And this purple line represents the overall trend of housing costs. In Ward 4, Midtown Kingston, we've seen a drastic increase in the housing costs overall. And one of the main reasons of that is that the property values were originally so low in January of 2018. And this is because this area has suffered from a lot of blight. It is home to a lot of minority groups. And we're quickly seeing a very high appreciation value in the housing costs. This is definitely a concern that we need to take into account spatially on what areas in Kingston are seeing this rise so quickly, because it can easily push out families of lower income and create problems of gentrification. In Ward 5 as well, for the 2 to 3 family units, we're also seeing a pretty big increase in the overall cost of housing. Again, with low property values being the original, and now with urban revitalization, we're seeing them increase. And throughout all the projections, you can see the different levels of rise and fall, but overall, throughout most of the wards, there is a overall increase in housing cost. There are a few wards with very slight decreases, but most of them are seeing a massive increase, and it's important to realize which parts of Kingston we need to be keeping an eye on to make sure that we can create affordable housing for people who may not be able to keep up with these increased costs. Another thing about the 2 to 3 family housing sales is that we're not only dealing with home ownership, but we're dealing with rentals. A lot of people who are buying these 2 to 3 family units are then renting out parts of their units to people. And a lot of these people are not going to be able to afford the increase. This is fancy. Okay. So yeah, a lot of the people that are buying these 2 to 3 family units now will be jacking up the rent because they're paying more originally for these pieces of property, and therefore the renters are going to have to pay more. And again, it's just showing how people are eventually going to be having to be paying more money, and a lot of these people don't have the estimated income to do so. And I hope this tool is something that we can update in the future and keep an eye on to make sure we know spatially what parts of Kingston are a major concern to us. Any questions?
Saying, Shane, about in some of the places there's red because the housing prices were already so low?
No, just in general, the scale is the blue properties you see on the projection are the lowest cost sales in that specific ward. The red are going to be the highest cost sales. I just wanted you guys to get a reference so you could see how many properties were more towards the red side, which would be a high-end price, and how many are blue and green.
Right, so that's a relative scale in the sales during the period.
Yep. Another thing to note is a lot of these blue properties are actually falling under the $1 mark. I haven't actually been able to figure out why yet. I need to dive deeper into it, but I'm assuming it could be handover houses, people giving their houses to relatives, or an auction type deal, but I'm not 100% sure.
Have something to do with, maybe they were foreclosed, the taxes weren't, like something the land bank might have taken over or something like that?
Exactly, it's that kind of a circumstance.
Okay.
Think no? Well, it doesn't make sense for it to be foreclosure, particularly because it would take a while to clear title, and it would be a short sale perhaps. But is that right?
So, but these maps are not quite to scale, and the streets are not.
Yeah, the streets aren't present on these current projections because we didn't find that the actual exact pinpoint location of each property was the main focus here. It was more to show the trend of how the costs are going in each individual ward and the volume of sales within that ward.
But of course,
Figure out how much the houses in my neighborhood are going for.
understood. There's an opportunity, of course, to turn
Yes.
on that as a layer and
Yeah.
see that with that.
That can definitely be made, no problem.
Now, what then, okay, so we have all this data. This is really powerful. It's very powerful to see it. It's visual.
Yes.
So what do we do with it?
I think that with this data, it's more of a tool to understand what's going on in each region of Kingston. And again, when we come to that question of what is the solution, that's the toughest question, obviously, and what we're here to do. I think it's just a good way for us to figure out in what areas we might be most affected and what areas we might want to focus on in specific.
There is also the question of relative values, because in some wards, the average cost of housing is lower or higher,
Yes.
right? And so it would be helpful to know those relations also to try to figure some of this out. And we're also running into this issue of what can we do in terms of people buying and selling private property? I can see some more legislation that's been done in other parts of the country relating to rental, relating to landlords and that sort of thing. But when we're talking about private housing, I'm not sure what kind of effects could we have. I mean, there's something that's outside of this, which is if we worked more at creating jobs that increased the salaries of people in Kingston without creating like a gold rush of people coming from outside Kingston because they hear they're high-paying jobs here.
Yeah.
How do we create better-paying jobs so we make sure that folks can afford the housing that's here?
So housing is part of an economic ecosystem, and no one intervention, no one strategy will be successful in isolation from others. One of the strategies that I know is in development in Kingston is the land bank or land bank strategy is one that concerns me sometimes because I think that it creates something other than home ownership model, because folks are not able to enjoy the full equity out of their property and all of the opportunities that come from the traditional equity that people earn in home ownership. But it's also a way of preserving affordability, and it's a strategy that I think is important, and one of the ones that the city of Kingston needs to explore and work on. And I'm confident that, I believe there's 37 properties that are 36? Right. I apologize. Yeah, I apologize, not the land bank, that's the land trust here. The land bank can play an instrumental role in that as well, because it will clear title, and it often works to remediate the barriers to a property being habitable. So we work with both models in different places, and but the community land trust model is a robust opportunity for the city to explore.
Investing, I would say, investing in the human capital is just as important as investing in the physical capital. You mentioned workforce development. So, wages. So you increase wages, you increase the power of purchasing. You increase the likelihood of someone perhaps going from being a renter into home ownership. They used to say ideal communities are 70% home ownership and 30% rental. Well, that has changed drastically over the last 10 years. That is the national home ownership rate, I think right now is about 63%, roughly. And it has been going down every year. But there's, so if you look at investment in these neighborhoods toward home ownership, it's a delicate balance. You want to see investment. You want to see property values going up. You're investing in a property. You don't want to make a bad financial decision, but simultaneously, you also want to mitigate exactly what Guy was talking about earlier, and that is displacement. Mitigating displacement is critical for a healthy community. It's also just being good person, but that's another story. So mitigating displacement, how can you do that? There's a lot of tools available to that. The land bank is one of them. Your community development block grant, that's another mitigating tool that you have, in that your CDBG dollars can be used for housing rehabilitation. Having local tax policy where you have phase-in of taxes, that's another mitigating policy. A set-aside, a 10%, a 15%, a 20% set-aside of all new units that are going up should be dedicated for affordable housing, mixed within the entire complex, not the situation that has occurred in New York City where you have 100 new units being built, 10 are set aside, and there's actually a pour door for the 10 units. That's not a good situation at all for lots of reasons. But set-asides is a very valuable tool. And it's a very common tool that's used in many of the cities. The city of Beacon instituted a set-aside. Many cities in Westchester County have set-asides. But what's important in creating policy in and around a set-aside is understanding the data, understanding the need, understanding the willingness, obviously, for all sides to come to the table in creating something that is really impactful for the entire community. So, you don't want to just say, well, we're going to blanketly decide that 10% is the set-aside. No, you have to really look at the numbers. Perhaps it's 20%, and perhaps it's a set-aside that is calculated at different levels of area median income. For example, you could have a 20% set-aside. A percentage of that could be for people at 50% AMI, or households at 60% AMI, households at 80% AMI, and so on and so forth. But you have to do a deep analysis of data in order to understand that. And I think what they're showing here, and Guy, correct me if I'm wrong, but this mapping exercise here about values is a very good first step. I think that in order to show where values have really gone and are going, a trend analysis, I think it'd be very interesting to see where they were 07, 08, which was right at the housing peak, where they were in 13 after the crash, where they are now, and I think you might be able to do a little projection analysis of this. But this is a great first step for Kingston to understand.
So of course the data looking back is available, that's not hard, but the challenge is assembling a data set that you can frame issues going forward and make policy judgments, and that was sort of the purpose of this tool. And in order for it to be valid, you're going to continue to have to layer on top of it new data. I appreciate very much what Joe said about inclusionary zoning, and it's something that's come up in the city of Kingston. The city does provide some requirements on developers for inclusionary affordable units in certain parts of the city, certain zoning districts, I understand. I would encourage, and in fact I think that your comprehensive plan, Kingston 2025, calls upon the city and guides the city to extend that throughout the city and not have it limited to specific zoning districts. And I think that's a good idea. I also think that the challenge associated with that is to well, there are two best practices I think I'd like to point to. First, not providing an escape hatch so that developers can simply buy their way out of creating the affordable housing units. We've seen in New Jersey where they have what's called fair share housing, and it's that kind of requirement, or like with the recreation fee that developers pay in lieu of creating parkland. If a developer is given the opportunity to pay a fee in lieu of creating the affordable housing, what's happened in New Jersey is the community ends up with a pile of money that they never spend to create the housing. That's why that's a bad practice, in my opinion. Require that the housing be built. Require that it be affordable to a segment of the community that is otherwise underserved. I actually chair an affordable housing board that does inclusionary zoning in the village of New Paltz. Again, a tiny little village in New Paltz. We're just a fraction of the city of Kingston. But, I got to tell you, for everything that's wrong, we have 5 units of affordable housing to folks, rental housing to folks at up to 60% of area median income in construction right now, and 2 that were completed last year. That's more than any other small village has done because we have that law and because we do that work. I'd encourage the city of Kingston to consider that and to consider expanding that so that it's citywide.
I just want to add one small piece. So, if a community were to look at a set aside and say, okay, we want to do a 10% set aside, and let's just assume for a moment that community is Kingston, since you've got some numbers in front of you. Just looking solely at the cost burden analysis for renters, with 1,690 households being severely cost burdened, in order to get them properly housed with a 10% set aside, you would have to build 16,900 units to achieve the 1,690. That math will not work. I do not know what your water and sewer capacity is right now, but I can almost guarantee you that it's not going to be able to handle 16,900 units. Neither would, what's that?
We're close.
You're close. So, set asides is a single tool, and some communities do have a payment in lieu of. When that works, and Guy is absolutely right, it's not a great tool, but when that works, the payout or that payment in lieu needs to be significant enough and put into a dedicated fund that is operated by a local housing not-for-profit agency who is mission-driven, where the funds go in the pool and they are used for affordable housing purposes, not for creating a park here or there or anywhere.
So that could be the land bank, right?
It could potentially, yes, go to, as long as there's an affordability criteria that is met.
So when we're talking about set-asides, inclusionary housing, and you said look closely at the data, so that suggests to me that you should not have one number, that in fact you should look where is the development going to happen, what kind of housing is in that area, and you would have a flexible ratio of affordable to market rate housing in a development if you're going to have both in one development, right? Well, okay, suppose you're going to have a development that's in an area that's already 80% affordable housing, just suppose. Then
Yes,
you
you want to
wouldn't
avoid.
necessarily want to put in, if you're going to have a new development there, you wouldn't necessarily say we have to have 20 or 30% or 10% or whatever affordable housing in that specific development. You might want to alter that number there, or vice versa. If it was an area where there was no affordable housing in that neighborhood or in that sector of the city,
You want to create affordable housing situations, affordable housing inventory in high opportunity areas, and you do not want to concentrate poverty in low income areas.
right, okay.
Absolutely, the worst thing you can do, you can end up with a tale of two cities, where you have affluent areas and you have pockets of deep concentrated generational poverty that have absolutely no opportunity of getting out. The worst case, personal opinion, the worst case is for a child to wake up every day, look out the window, and never see someone getting up, going to work, having a purpose in life. The worst thing that they can do is look out the window and see nothing but despair. Wouldn't you want that child in an area where there is opportunity, where they see things that are positive instead of always the negative? I'm not saying that every single area of concentrated poverty is full of negative. What I'm saying is you need to give the opportunity. I don't mean you, I mean in general.
So that certainly guides some of the decision-making that RUPCO has utilized here in Kingston. We know that there was, for 30 years, a boarded-up structure at the lace mill. And the reinvestment there, I think, is transformative in terms of inspiring folks to give them not only new neighbors who are creative and a new and vibrant place to live in your community, but the notion that kids were maybe walking by a dark factory serving no potential benefit to the community for a generation is staggering to me. It's just staggering. Likewise, going by a boarded-up bowling alley, that everything, including the lanes that were in it, were ripped out and sold off, and thinking that that's okay is kind of in my assessment, unfortunate oversight from for the community. I think that we believe that the market will do what the market always does, which is they will go where the opportunities are to create the housing that is most profitable for them to create, and they will therefore not create the affordable units that serve low and moderate income Kingstonians. And that's why it's important to provide a requirement and incentives for them to do so, or it simply won't happen. And from a policy perspective, that needs to guide your decision making. I hope that's helpful in terms of thinking about policy going forward. I guess I love working in Kingston because if there was any community in the Hudson Valley that holds the promise of addressing a wide range of needs in a wide variety of contexts and serving the overall housing need of this community, because one size doesn't fit all, this is the place that it could happen. And so that's why I've been really inspired by being in so many of these meetings here in the Common Council and hearing the conversation and seeing the awareness and understanding grow. And I think that there's really been a tremendous amount of learning and capacity building on the part of the Common Council to think more expansively about how you meet community needs.
Could I ask, Joe, you mentioned one thing, phasing of taxes. Are you talking about in terms of property taxes, like having a marginal rate for property taxes, or what is that?
Yeah, for example, a first-time home buyer who is receiving some kind of a subsidy for either down payment or closing cost assistance. Because they're a first-time home buyer, there are real property tax laws under the state of New York where you can phase in their property tax. So I'm making numbers up totally. Instead of day one, if the property tax is $10,000, instead of starting at $10,000, perhaps they start at $5,000 and it ramps up over time. So it's $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, so on and so forth. And these formulas and laws are all in place, and communities can opt in, and they can also change and create their own more not restrictive, but more beneficial local policy. And that goes for rehab as well. In some communities, if you replace your roof, your assessment's going to go up.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was going to be my question. A lot of I think we've had some businesses where they got a break where you kind of can ease into that as well, because there's the incentive to make your property better has to be real, and it's not if you're going to pay a lot more in taxes like the next year. So if that you're eased into that, then I think I'm glad you brought that up, though.
And a personal note, if my roof is brand new, why am I paying more for services in a tax bill? I have a new roof. Is that going to cost the city or the town or the village more to provide a service to me? No, I know there's more to the formula, but it's just kind of odd. And the other people, and I don't know who's in the audience here at all, but who I don't see or who I may not know that is here, school board officials. I don't know what the breakdown is in Kingston off the top of my head, but generally speaking, 68% of your tax bill is the school tax. We always talk about taxes are too high, and we think about what we pay town and village and county tax. Think about what you pay in school tax, and I think the school board needs to be at this very table in understanding all of this conversation, because it helps create policy and it helps create the ability to set pilot tax payments. Schools don't always participate in that, and they should. If you have a declining enrollment, theoretically, your costs should go down. It never does. And my last little, up on the stool pledge is, get out and vote, because the school just passed a lot of budgets with very little disruption.
So I have a couple of thoughts that I want to add about another aspect of this ecosystem of housing and how it interacts with community. So,
Ask one question.
oh, sure. Sure, sorry.
Set-asides, now how would that, or would something like that work for landlords and developers also, rather than just property owners? It would, so it would be the same scenario.
It's a similar scenario, it's different language. It's similar language, it's under a different real property tax law, because they may be commercial properties as opposed to one or two family home.
So what I was going to mention is that the work that we're doing in Kingston around community wealth building and job creation is in Midtown in particular at the Metro is something that we're really proud of, and it's something that we were called to do. And but I've always observed that there are tools that we put at the disposal of commercial development that for job creation that aren't typically made available to housing. So there are lots and lots of communities that have shovel-ready programs, sites for development that are served by water and sewer and transportation and so forth, that are ripe for development, and maybe even they're provided with tax incentives to locate there. But we don't do that for housing. Why not? Why don't we take that tool from over there and put it over here to create the housing that we need in our communities? Why not think about, it's kind of progressive idea, right? Shovel-ready sites for housing opportunities.
Final word? No.
No. No discussion here. We'll have a couple of minutes. I think we've got time now. So you'll have a minute or 3 minutes to speak. Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. This is really amazing, all the work that you've put into this. You've given us a lot of really good ideas. And now all we have to do is think through how to turn this into action, legislation, encouragement of the different stakeholders that we've talked to. It's a really fitting ending to the hearings that we've been putting on. So we appreciate your work here, and we appreciate, too, everybody who's taken part in these all the way through.
Rennie,
So-
thank you for doing this. This was a big undertaking. I know you put in a lot of time and effort into this, so thank you.
Then we'll thank Brenna Robinson also. Brenna was crucial in getting lots of folks here, recording it, and being the real guiding light behind it. All right, thank you very much. So, Rich, is
Guys
it?
were fantastic.
You can just speak from there. Is that microphone working?
I'd like to refer to.
Oh, he can use this one. If you'll, use.
So, hi. Yeah, my name is Rich Lanzarone. I'm actually a fellow, you can time me. I'm a fellow of the Mid-Hudson Pattern for Progress. I'm also a graduate of the Ulster Leadership Institute. I'm also a landlord in the city of Kingston. So I just want to point out a couple of things. So we had here, I'm just going to show you that we had an increase in housing cost, but the reason it was so low here is because the area was blighted. So would one suggest that this is a bad thing? That we want to keep the housing cost at that level, meaning that we want to keep the area blighted, because to move from blight to an improved area requires investment. Investment costs money, and so that's naturally going to drive up the cost of housing. Now, a couple of important points. You made a point about jobs. Turns out if you look at the study by Pattern for Progress, most of the jobs in the city of Kingston really create no value. They're service jobs. That's one of the problems we have. The other thing is that, also from that study, it says that 56% of the housing in the city of Kingston, it was built before 1939. And actually, a lot of it was actually a lot earlier than that. Because I own houses that are 120 up to 240 years old. Now, to keep those buildings and improve them, I have a building that no money was put into that building for 80 years. I want to improve that building. It's been depleted. How can I do that if I'm restrained in being able to recoup my investment? I mean, why would I do that, right? I mean, so you don't want to disincentivize going from blight to improvement. Now, what I suggest is you don't want to concentrate, but some good ideas. Some cities in New York have incentivized development. 1,645, 16,000 houses is not reasonable. 1,645 are achievable if you incentivize developers to develop 1,645. How would you do that? I would create it within each ward, so this is distributed, opportunity zones, so that you tell developers, if you develop in these opportunity zones spread evenly throughout the city, we're going to give you a 50% tax abatement for 10 years that'll increase, blah, blah, blah. This has been very effective. So, you know, this is actually much more effective, I believe, than trying to restrain the forces of the market, because that never works. And actually, in the city of San Francisco and the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, instituted rent stabilization, and what they found was that actually resulted in a reduction in the number of rentable units. So it exacerbated the shortage. And the city of Ossining in the Hudson Valley, which was in the geographical zone, adopted rent stabilization, and then after a few years decided it was really not a good idea and decided to not do it. So I just want to say that you know, I haven't been to the other 6 meetings, but I didn't really hear a lot of on the other side of the argument. There was a lot of, I just wanted to, you know, share. I have a building on the corner of Wall Street and St. James. If you know, it's the pink building. It's dilapidated. It's an eyesore. It's got boarded up windows, right? It'll cost $100,000 to $200,000 to restore that building to something that should be presenting the city of Kingston. Now, why would I do that if I can never recoup my investment, or it's stretched out over 20 years where it's really not practical, right? So you need to think about that. The other thing is that there's a differentiation between, I'm a small landlord, sure, and you know, there are some large landlords, and I think the council needs to differentiate between different classes of landlords. Quite honestly, I don't own 100 or 200 apartments. You know, I own 12, right? And I feel I'm a good landlord. I'm very responsive, and I want to keep improving my properties. And I think the city wants me to do that. Unfortunately, investing that money is going to result in increases in rent. It's the only way it works. So I just wanted to get those points across. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to make those points. Thank you.
Yeah, we have on our website, we have the previous, all but one of the previous sessions, and one of them was specifically for landlords, and a number of them were people who owned a few units, like you're talking about. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. Anybody have anything, Rashida? Zone? Don't forget to push the button.
Thank you. So I'll sit over here. So I'm Rashida Tyler. I'm a community activist with Citizen Action of New York and with the Kingston Tenants Union. And a lot of what we advocate for has already been said today by Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. And while we agree with a lot of what has been said, and especially advocating for good cause eviction legislation, we really do feel that legislation that assists landlords, such as was just being spoken about by Pattern for Progress, that can be beneficial, but we have to watch that it doesn't become a double-edged sword, where we try to pit things like education against housing, because these things are, things that are basic to us as a community. And whether there is any type of subsequent decline in attendance does not necessarily mean there's going to be a drop in the expenses that a school district has associated with that. We know that in order to have a good society and to make sure our children are well prepared going out into a global economy, that with technology, our education system has to keep pace. So the attaching of housing costs to education is not mutually exclusive. I think also that, and I did have prepared testimony, but I, also am realizing the time, so I don't want to necessarily read it. But it was a testimony that I read to the New York State Senate in Newburgh when they had the housing hearing. And it basically says that we're in the Hudson Valley, we're facing a housing crisis. We're being squeezed from with less and less units being available due to Airbnb. We have, we're one of the top destinations for Airbnb, which is great. And having a healthy tourism economy is wonderful, but not at the expense of people who live here year round and people who want to start families here and live in Kingston. So I think any type of legislation that we do have should also be paired with legislation on short-term rentals, because landlords who may feel that, oh, it's too difficult to push a person out, it's too difficult for me to do this, will turn and start trying to rent their apartments for Airbnbs. So we as the Kingston Tenants Union, we advocate for short-term rental regulation as well. But yeah, I did just want to say that we are not pitting housing against education in any way, shape, and or form. Thank you.
I'm Evelyn Wright. I live in Ward 9. I want to thank the council for putting on these hearings. I want to echo what was said earlier about it's really been a great learning process. I've attended several of them, and I really appreciate the thorough job you're doing in trying to investigate these really crucial issues. I just wanted to share my reflection on what I've heard. It seems like some of the issues that are facing us are issues that are facing the whole region, and indeed lots of parts of the country. Shortage of affordable housing, gentrification, a lack of jobs to support people in housing that we have. And I think the city needs to really think creatively about how we do economic development and how we do housing development in many of the ways that have been suggested. But it seems like there's other issues that are really particular to the city of Kingston. I was dismayed to hear tonight from Mr. Haynes that the courts here seem to be more biased in favor of landlords than in other parts of the state, facing the same laws. I don't know whether there's something we can do about that in the short run, but I think the most upsetting thing that I heard at these hearings was the failure of the city building and safety inspection process to ensure that buildings are safe and to respond appropriately to tenants' complaints, and in some cases to be abused by landlords to remove tenants without going through the evictions process. And I think that seems like something the council could tackle in the short term, and I hope that that'll be near the priority list as something that's particular to us that we can really make some progress on, that's under our control. And thank you.
There's less echo with it. Okay. The other thing Evelyn hasn't told you is that she's an economist with incredible knowledge about the cooperative business structure, which is one possible solution that no one has mentioned, and Evelyn does know about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about was federal opportunity zones, which you mentioned. Federal opportunity zones are they're a wonderful idea, and they could be They could be a force for good, and they could be just another way of shoveling more money at people who already have too much. And I hope that this is something that government will look into. Right now, there's no obligation to make public if you are involved in a fund, in an opportunity zone fund. I would hope that any time that there is any public money asked or any permits asked of you, that you would insist on asking that question, are you involved in an opportunity fund? Because if the person asking for money is, they could very well be the beneficiary of huge reductions in capital gains on their project. The other thing is that I would love it if government would get involved in helping in a public-private partnership, because opportunity zones don't just have to be for real estate. They can also be for businesses. And there's no law that says they can't be for cooperative business structures. And there's also no law, especially since Ben Carson recently said he was going to do this, that he's going to fast track all the tax credits that he's in charge of, including the LIHTC tax credit for opportunity zone investors. So you are the guardians of making sure that this does not become a pigs at the trough situation. That is your responsibility. You are the ones who have the power to make sure that that is not how the federal opportunity zones devolve in the county of, in the city of Kingston. And that is a bit, I have personally seen this county, the school board, the library, huge tax boondoggles. I have seen that with my own eyes. That was a previous it was a previous year. I hope that you will consider yourselves guardians of tax money so that this does not happen again. Thank you.
Can I just jump in and talk for a second about opportunity zones? Because it really is a subject that interests me, and I won't take long. But I participated in a conference in Washington just a couple of months ago, and the conference included a session, a plenary on opportunity zones. A couple of things to know about opportunity zones that concerns me is that, first, they are not a permanent investment in a community. They are a temporary investment in a community, and they get repaid. And one of the concerns about repaying the investment in an opportunity zone is that the interest payable in exchange for the long-term investment is very, very high. And so what that means at some point is that you've built an economic house of cards that is in the potential of collapsing when that temporary investment in the opportunity zone is taken back out. That's a real concern in a disinvestment community that has suffered over a period of time. To put in even a 20-year investment that must be repaid over time means that 20 years from now, you're going to have another situation of a project going belly up and being unable to pay down its debt. Debt is what drives the cost of rents, whether it's commercial or residential. And you got to remember, this is just a different way of allocating debt. Another question that's come up, and I heard it touched on this evening about opportunity zones, is that it's awfully difficult in the current program to discern what is a proper investment. We know where that investment should occur because the zones were so designated by the Regional Economic Development Council, nominated to the federal government, and then designated by the federal government as the opportunities, the locations for those investments to be made. But there's no criteria for them. And the question that was being knocked around in Washington was, how will we know that this is an investment we want to make? There are similar programs like the New Market Tax Credit Program, which provides similar types of investments in disadvantaged communities, in blighted communities, to create jobs. It's typically about job creation. It's not about housing. And those investments are held to performance against a set of community development metrics around the job creation and around alleviating poverty and around creating pathways to wealth and a successful community. And there's no similar guidance for the Opportunity Zones program. I volunteered at this meeting that there actually is a model that Opportunity Zones could look to, and that's the equitable development program that Kingston brought here from the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And we started down that path here, and I pointed to, wow, that's a program that has significant community participation and can result in a plan for how investment that meets community goals will occur. And unfortunately, I'm not aware of any community, including Kingston, that's actually created an equitable development plan for the community. But that would give you your metrics. That would explain what the investment that you want in the community is and why it's desirable and what the outcomes are. And absent that, opportunity zones is what a lot of people think it is, which is a short-term investment that benefits very, very wealthy people who don't live in the zone itself, and ultimately take that money and those benefits to their gated community someplace else.
All right. Okay. Yes, the press wants to speak. Tell us who you are, though.
Hillary Harvey, Radio Kingston. I'm wondering about this. Just for clarification, is this a tool that RUPCO developed that you're giving to the city, and you will be using that in your?
You'll need to ask Guy that. So why don't you take that up with him?
Oh, okay.
After.
Okay, and then my other question is, what are the next steps? This is the last of the housing hearings, so what are the next steps?
We were hoping you had the answer.
Do you have like a time frame for how this will proceed? No.
We don't have a time frame. We're working with lots of different folks. We're looking at lots of different possibilities. We've gotten some really rich ideas tonight. I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to capture the information that we've gotten in all of these 7 hearings. We've got it on video, but not everybody's going to sit down and watch all 14 hours, right? So unless
I did.
Survivor or so we have to think it through. We don't have a specific plan, but our aim is to figure out several things. One, are there things we can do where we bring people together? I mean, part of this is initiating conversations, getting to meet people. So we didn't know that Justin lived in the 9th Ward. We didn't know that Evelyn lived in the 9th Ward, right? So we get people together and start talking and seeing what they can come up with, because there are people in town who do have money for investment, for example. They may not be aware of what could come of investment in affordable housing. So part of this is just getting conversations going. Another part is thinking about how to involve the community more in developing the solutions. So Guy was talking about the equitable development plan. We've talked about the possibility of a generic environmental impact statement, which would do the sort of thing that we've heard about, where we would have interested parties throughout the city, whoever wanted to take part, and maybe some invited people too, to get together and basically do a kind of environmental impact statement that would say, here are the places where we can have these kinds of developments. So if developers come to town and they say, hey, we're looking at this property, what you got? And we can say, yep, that'll go there, or no, it won't. Or the city can then say, hey, we have an idea for this area or this piece of property. Let's go find a developer to work on it, right? So if we do that kind of work in advance, we don't end up with controversial projects going on like we have in the recent past, theoretically. So the other thing then would be legislation. What are some regulations that we need to develop? We've talked about the possibility of rent control, rent stabilization rather, good causes, eviction laws. Part of that is we have to wait and see what happens at the state level, because all 9 of those tenant protection bills are still up in the air at the moment. We got to see what actually comes out of the Assembly and the Senate at the state level, and there's also that guy in the governor's mansion who's got to sign them, right? So we got to see what happens. We'll know that after June 15th. So we can't give you any specifics because we got to sit down. We got to go through all of this stuff. But this is why we did it. We did these hearings specifically so that we've got information, we've got good stories, and we've got some ideas of how to go forward. We also, though, what Joe is giving us is what we've really been missing, and that's valid data. We've seen lots of numbers flying around about recent projects that have just been way off the wall. Some of them have been valid, some of them just, I don't even know where they came from. So, you know, the other thing that we really have to be careful about is finding ways to develop the data, look at where we've got actual data sources, and then doing some other things to find out what data we don't have so we can make really good informed decisions. It's not a total answer to your question, but
So it's a process.
that's the short
Short
answer,
is
yes.
it's a process. Okay.
I got to fill up the time. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate everybody's efforts. Also, if you know anybody who wants to contribute still, we will take written notice. We'll take letters, emails, phone calls. Anybody who wants to get in touch with us, let us know. Thank you.